In the spring of 1831, as I wandered through the bustling streets of New York and Philadelphia, I witnessed something extraordinary that would forever change my understanding of human freedom. Here was a nation drunk on liberty, yet mysteriously enslaved by its own freedom. Americans spoke endlessly of their independence, their rights, their boundless opportunities, yet I observed them conforming to unwritten rules more rigid than any European aristocracy had ever imposed. They had broken the chains of kings only to forge new ones from public opinion itself. This is democracy's most dangerous secret, one that threatens every free society. The very equality that liberates can become the instrument of a new and more complete tyranny. The Americans, in their zealous pursuit of freedom, had stumbled upon a contradiction that strikes at the heart of democratic life. Freedom itself contains the seeds of its own destruction. Today, as I watch this same pattern unfold across the modern world with even greater intensity, I invite you to examine this hidden paradox that I first discovered in the American experiment nearly 2 centuries ago, a paradox that determines whether democracy will flourish or perish in our time. Chapter 1: The Democratic Revolution and Its Unexpected Chains. When I first set foot on American soil in May 1831, I expected to find a society completely liberated from the hierarchies that had constrained human potential for millennia. What I discovered was far more complex and troubling. The Democratic Revolution had indeed shattered the visible chains of aristocracy, but in their place arose invisible bonds more powerful than any nobleman's decree had ever been. In aristocratic societies, inequality was visible, accepted, even celebrated as part of the natural order. A peasant knew his place and, paradoxically, found within those boundaries a certain freedom of thought. He might rebel against his condition, dream of bettering his lot, but he rarely doubted his right to his own opinions, his own judgments about the world around him. The American experiment revealed something unprecedented in human history. When men become equal in condition, they develop an insatiable need to be equal in all things, in thought, in desire, in aspiration, in success. This passion for equality becomes more than a political principle. It transforms into a moral imperative that penetrates every aspect of social life, creating new forms of conformity more complete than any imposed by force. I watched Americans police themselves with a vigilance no king had ever achieved, scrutinizing each other's opinions, behaviors, and even private beliefs with an intensity that would have impressed the most thorough secret police. They had internalized the democratic spirit so completely that deviation from common opinion became not just unpopular, but literally unthinkable. In Boston drawing rooms and frontier taverns alike, I witnessed the same phenomenon, conversations that began with apparent diversity gradually converging toward identical conclusions, as if guided by an invisible hand toward conformity. The same people who had fought wars for independence now voluntarily surrendered their intellectual independence to the tyranny of public sentiment. The genius of American institutions lay not in their formal structures, though these were admirable, but in their ability to channel this democratic energy constructively. The Constitution, the Federalist system, the separation of powers, all these were brilliant innovations. Yet even as I admired their town meetings and voluntary associations, I sensed a darker current beneath the surface of American freedom. The same equality that empowered citizens to govern themselves also created an overwhelming pressure to think alike, to desire the same things, to measure success by identical standards, to conform to what the majority deemed appropriate or virtuous. The Democratic Revolution had created not just political freedom, but a new form of social tyranny, one exercised not by a monarch who could be identified and resisted, but by the people themselves, making resistance seem not just futile but morally wrong. This was the first glimpse of democracy's central contradiction. The very conditions that make freedom possible also make it vulnerable to destruction by its own success. Chapter 2: When the majority becomes a new kind of tyrant. During my extensive travels through America, From the sophisticated salons of Boston to the rough settlements of the frontier, I encountered a phenomenon that chilled my democratic enthusiasm and revealed democracy's darkest potential: the tyranny of the majority. This was not merely theoretical speculation but observed reality. In Hartford, Connecticut, I met a businessman who had dared to criticize a popular political decision regarding local taxation. Though he faced no legal punishment, the Constitution protected his right to speak. He found himself ostracized by his neighbors, excluded from business opportunities, shunned at social gatherings, and treated as a moral pariah by the very community he had served for decades. "I am free to speak," he told me with bitter irony, "but who will listen? I am free to write, but who will read? I am free to act, but who will associate with a man the majority has condemned? My legal rights remain intact, yet I am more powerless than any slave, for a slave's master has an interest in preserving his property, but the majority has no interest in preserving my dignity." This was not the crude oppression of despotism, where chains are visible and resistance can be heroic. This was something far more subtle and, perhaps, more dangerous, a tyranny that operated through the voluntary cooperation of its victims. The majority in America wielded a power more absolute than any European tyrant because it claimed to represent the people's will. Who could oppose it without seeming to oppose democracy itself? Who could resist the majority without appearing to reject the fundamental principle of popular sovereignty? I observed how this majority tyranny operated through mechanisms unknown to traditional despotism. Public opinion became an invisible tribunal that pronounced judgment without appeal, creating a social atmosphere where dissent was not forbidden but made psychologically impossible. Newspapers, which I had expected to be guardians of free thought and diverse opinion, became instruments of conformity, reflecting and amplifying majority sentiment rather than challenging it with alternative perspectives. The very diversity of voices I had anticipated in a free society was drowned out by the deafening chorus of popular opinion. The Americans had solved the ancient problem of preventing the abuse of power by rulers. They had created checks and balances, separation of powers, constitutional limits on government authority. But they had created a new and perhaps more intractable problem: preventing the abuse of power by the ruled themselves. The majority could silence opposition more effectively than any secret police, simply by withdrawing social approval, economic opportunity, and community membership. This was tyranny perfected, voluntary, enthusiastic, and democratic. What made this tyranny particularly insidious was its invisibility to those who exercised it. Americans believed themselves to be the freest people on earth, and in many measurable ways they were. Yet they had created a social mechanism that could crush individual independence more thoroughly than any monarch. The majority ruled not just through laws and political institutions, but through customs, habits, social expectations, and the irresistible pressure of collective judgment. Chapter 3: The Vital Role of Associations in Preserving Individual Liberty. Yet America also showed me the antidote to this democratic poison, a remedy that emerged naturally from the genius of the American people themselves. In every village and town, from the smallest farming community to the largest commercial city, I witnessed something remarkable that distinguished America from every other society I had studied. Americans had an almost instinctive tendency to form associations for every conceivable purpose. They created voluntary organizations for moral improvement, political action, religious worship, commercial enterprise, educational advancement, charitable work, and social entertainment. Where Europeans instinctively looked to government or hereditary institutions to solve problems, Americans looked to each other. I invite you to pause and consider your own civic participation for a moment. How many voluntary associations do you belong to? How often do you engage with neighbors to solve common problems? When did you last attend a town meeting, join a community organization, or participate in a local civic project? This is not mere curiosity, your answer reveals the health of democracy itself. For these associations serve as intermediary powers between the isolated individual and the overwhelming state, preventing the total subjugation of the private will to the public will. In these voluntary associations, I discovered democracy's greatest safeguard against its own excesses. When individuals join together for specific purposes, whether organizing a fire company, establishing a school, building a church, or improving local roads, they learn to combine freedom with cooperation in ways that aristocratic subjects never could. They experience leadership and submission by turns, learning that authority can be temporary and consensual rather than permanent and imposed. They discover that their private interests often align with the common good, but they also learn to defend their particular views against majority pressure within the association itself. These associations create what I came to see as democracy's essential infrastructure, a vast network of intermediate bodies that break up the potentially oppressive uniformity of democratic society. In a township meeting deciding about road repairs, citizens learn to argue respectfully about public expenditures. In a religious congregation debating moral questions, members practice defending minority opinions against majority sentiment. In a professional society establishing standards, individuals balance personal interests with collective needs. Through all these experiences, Americans practice democracy in its most authentic form, learning skills that formal political institutions could never teach. The associations also served as schools of freedom, teaching lessons no textbook could convey. In them, individuals learned that liberty requires responsibility, that rights come with duties, that effective action requires both independence and cooperation, that leadership involves service rather than dominance. They discovered that democracy is not simply majority rule, a crude mechanism that could easily become tyrannical, but a complex art of living together while preserving individual dignity and conscience. Without these voluntary associations, American democracy would have devolved into either anarchy or soft despotism. The associations channeled democratic energy constructively while providing refuges for those whose opinions diverged from majority sentiment. They transformed potential conflict into productive collaboration and prevented the dangerous homogenization that threatens all democratic societies with spiritual death. Chapter 4: The Seductive Danger of Democratic Individualism. As I traveled deeper into American society and observed its daily rhythms over many months, I encountered another paradox that struck at the very heart of democratic freedom. The same equality that encouraged association and civic cooperation also promoted a peculiar form of individualism, one that threatened to undermine the very social bonds that made democratic cooperation possible in the first place. Americans celebrated individual achievement and self-reliance with an intensity unknown in aristocratic societies, yet this celebration carried within it the seeds of democratic destruction, creating isolation where connection was most needed. In aristocratic societies, individuals were bound to their stations by visible chains of obligation and dependence that, however restrictive, created webs of social connection. A nobleman owed duties to his king and his tenants, a peasant had obligations to his lord and his extended family, a merchant was tied to his guild and his customers. These bonds, however limiting to individual freedom, created a network of relationships that sustained community life through mutual obligation and shared responsibility. Democracy shattered these chains of interdependence, and rightly so. They were often unjust and oppressive. But what would replace them? I observed Americans retreating into what I termed individualism, not the heroic selfishness of aristocratic honor, which at least acknowledged broader social connections, but something more systematic and dangerous, a calm and considered feeling that disposes each citizen to isolate himself from the mass of his fellows and withdraw into the circle of family and friends, leaving the greater society to shift for itself. This was not mere selfishness, which is a vice of all ages and conditions, but something more subtle, a philosophical error about the nature of human existence. Americans began to believe that they owed nothing to any man and expected nothing from any man except what they could purchase in the marketplace. They formed the habit of thinking of themselves in isolation and imagined that their whole destiny was in their own hands, forgetting the countless social connections that made their individual success possible. This democratic individualism threatened freedom more subtly than tyranny because it appeared virtuous and was celebrated as the highest achievement of democratic society. Americans praised self-reliance while neglecting the civic duties that sustained their democracy. They celebrated private success while public institutions languished from neglect. They enjoyed the fruits of association while avoiding the labor of maintaining associative life for future generations. The danger was not immediate oppression, which would provoke resistance, but gradual erosion of the social fabric. As citizens withdrew from public life into private concerns, they left the field open to administrative despotism, not the dramatic tyranny of conquerors, but the quiet expansion of bureaucratic control that would fill the vacuum left by civic withdrawal. Government would grow not through ambition but through apparent necessity, managing a society where individuals could no longer manage themselves collectively. This individualism also created a psychological trap that I observed everywhere in American society. The more Americans emphasized individual achievement, the more anxiously they compared themselves to their equals, creating a restless materialism that undermined the very contentment necessary for sustained civic engagement. Chapter 5: Religion and Morality as Democracy's Invisible Foundation. In my conversations with Americans from every walk of life, farmers and merchants, lawyers and laborers, ministers and skeptics, I was struck by a curious phenomenon that revealed another essential dimension of democracy's hidden contradictions. Despite their constitutional separation of church and state, which Europeans often misunderstood as hostility to religion, Americans remained profoundly religious in their daily lives, and I gradually understood that their democracy depended upon this religious foundation in ways that neither believers nor skeptics fully appreciated. Take a moment to consider a fundamental question about your own moral life. What gives you ultimate authority in your daily ethical decisions? Is it popular opinion, personal preference, religious conviction, philosophical principle, or some combination of these sources? Your honest answer reveals something crucial about democracy's sustainability, for democratic government requires citizens capable of moral self-restraint, but democracy itself cannot command the respect necessary to enforce such restraint without becoming tyrannical. In Europe, I had witnessed attempts to build democracy on purely rational foundations, the French Revolution being the most dramatic example, and I had seen them crumble when immediate interests conflicted with long-term civic duty. The revolutionaries had tried to create a religion of reason and a cult of the supreme being, but these artificial constructions could not provide the moral authority that traditional religion had supplied for centuries. Americans had solved this problem, perhaps unconsciously, by maintaining religious belief alongside political freedom, creating a unique synthesis that strengthened both faith and democracy. Religion in America served democracy in ways that neither ardent believers nor militant skeptics fully appreciated. It taught Americans that they were accountable to something higher than majority opinion, providing a crucial check on democratic despotism that no secular philosophy could match. When citizens believed themselves answerable to God for their actions, they were less likely to surrender their moral judgment to popular pressure. It encouraged voluntary moral restraint, reducing the need for external coercion that would undermine democratic freedom. It created communities of shared values that transcended immediate material interests, binding people together across economic and social divisions. Perhaps most importantly, religion fostered what I called habits of the heart, the daily practices of moral consideration that made democratic cooperation possible. Americans learned in their churches to consider the welfare of others, to moderate their desires for immediate gratification, to accept temporary sacrifice for permanent benefit, to forgive injuries and work toward reconciliation. These were precisely the qualities that democratic citizenship required but that democratic institutions could not directly teach. The genius of American religious practice lay in its voluntary character and competitive diversity. Because no church could claim state support, all had to appeal to individual conscience and demonstrate their value through the quality of life they promoted. This created a competitive marketplace of moral ideas that strengthened rather than weakened religious influence, as denominations competed to offer the most compelling vision of virtuous living. Yet I also sensed the fragility of this arrangement and worried about its long-term sustainability. As democratic individualism advanced and material prosperity increased, would Americans continue to accept religious authority? Could secular philosophy provide the moral foundation that democracy required? These questions haunted my observations and continue to shape democratic struggles today. Chapter 6: The Eternal Tension Between Equality and Freedom. The longer I remained in America, observing its society through multiple seasons and diverse circumstances, the more clearly I perceived what I came to understand as democracy's most fundamental and irreconcilable contradiction: the eternal tension between equality and freedom. These two principles, which Americans believed to be naturally allied and mutually reinforcing, were in fact locked in a philosophical and practical conflict that could never be permanently resolved, only constantly managed through the art of democratic statesmanship. Americans loved equality with a passion that bordered on religious devotion and that often shocked my aristocratic sensibilities. They would rather be equal in slavery than unequal in freedom, a preference that horrified me but revealed democracy's deepest emotional truth. Equality was not simply a political arrangement or constitutional principle, it was democracy's defining passion, its moral center, its emotional core, the force that gave democratic movements their revolutionary energy and their dangerous potential for excess. This passion for equality manifested itself in countless ways throughout American society. Americans resented any distinction not earned through individual merit, yet they constantly created new distinctions based on wealth, education, talent, or achievement. They celebrated individual success while demanding that everyone have equal opportunity to succeed. They insisted on equal treatment under law while recognizing that equal treatment often produced dramatically unequal results. They proclaimed that all men are created equal while practicing slavery and excluding women from political participation, contradictions that would eventually tear their society apart. The tension became most acute when equality and freedom pointed in opposite directions, as they frequently did in practical governance. Freedom allowed individuals to develop their talents fully, accumulate wealth through industry and skill, and rise above their origins through merit and effort, but such achievements inevitably created inequalities of condition that challenged democratic equality. Equality demanded that society limit such achievements to preserve equal standing among citizens, but such limits necessarily restricted the very freedom that made democracy attractive. I watched Americans struggle with this contradiction in their daily political life. They wanted both the dynamism that freedom created and the security that equality promised. They desired both individual excellence and social harmony, both competition and cooperation, both merit-based advancement and equal dignity for all citizens. They celebrated both the entrepreneur who built great enterprises and the common farmer who maintained democratic virtue through honest labor. The resolution of this tension required constant balancing, endless adjustment, perpetual vigilance, and the kind of practical wisdom that could not be reduced to simple formulas or constitutional mechanisms. Americans had to preserve enough freedom to maintain social energy and economic prosperity while ensuring enough equality to preserve democratic legitimacy and social cohesion. They had to allow enough inequality to reward merit and encourage excellence while preventing so much inequality that it destroyed the equal citizenship that democracy requires. This balance could never be permanently achieved because the underlying tension was permanent and rooted in the nature of human society itself. Each generation would have to find its own equilibrium between these competing values. and each solution would create new problems requiring new adjustments. Democracy was not a destination that could be reached, but a journey, an ongoing experiment in managing irreconcilable human aspirations without destroying the society that made such management possible. Chapter 7: Tocqueville's Warnings for Modern American Democracy. Nearly 2 centuries have passed since my journey through America, yet the contradictions I observed have not only persisted but intensified with a force that would have astonished even my pessimistic imagination. The technologies that connect you globally have also created new forms of majority tyranny more powerful and pervasive than anything I witnessed in the 1830s. Social media platforms function as digital town squares where public opinion forms and hardens with frightening speed, often silencing dissenting voices more effectively than any government censorship, creating what amounts to a global panopticon of peer surveillance. Your modern individualism has evolved far beyond what I observed into what might be called networked isolation. You are simultaneously more connected and more alone than any people in human history. Americans today can customize their information sources, social circles, commercial environments, and even their physical surroundings to reflect their personal preferences and prejudices, creating echo chambers that make the conformity I witnessed in your ancestors seem diverse and open-minded by comparison. You have achieved a form of voluntary segregation that undermines the random encounters and chance conversations that are essential to democratic deliberation and mutual understanding. The voluntary associations that I identified as democracy's salvation have weakened dramatically over the past half-century. Americans increasingly bowl alone, as one of your scholars put it, worship in smaller and more homogeneous communities, and participate less frequently in the civic organizations that once bridged social divisions and taught democratic skills. Labor unions, professional associations, religious congregations, neighborhood groups, and local political organizations, all have seen declining membership and reduced influence. This decline of associative life leaves individuals more vulnerable to both market manipulation and political demagogy, while reducing the opportunities for the kind of democratic education that only voluntary cooperation can provide. Your contemporary struggles with economic inequality have reached proportions that threaten democratic legitimacy itself. The tension between equality and freedom that I identified as democracy's central challenge has become acute as economic differences translate into political influence in ways that mock the principle of equal citizenship. When concentrated wealth can purchase political access, fund electoral campaigns, and shape public policy, the equality of citizenship that democracy requires becomes fictional. The American dream of equal opportunity becomes a cruel joke when starting positions are so unequal that genuine competition becomes impossible. The role of religion in providing moral foundation for democratic life has become more complicated as American society has become more diverse and secular. The habits of the heart that religious communities once cultivated, self-restraint, concern for others, willingness to sacrifice immediate gratification for long-term benefit, must now be fostered through secular institutions that may lack the moral authority that religious conviction provided. This represents a profound challenge for democratic sustainability. Yet I also observe encouraging signs that suggest democracy's continuing adaptive capacity and the enduring vitality of the American democratic spirit. Americans continue to form new associations through digital platforms, though these often lack the face-to-face interaction that builds genuine social bonds. You create innovative solutions to public problems through crowdsourcing, social entrepreneurship, and civic technology. You demonstrate the civic energy and voluntary cooperation that impressed me nearly 2 centuries ago, though channeled through new forms and media. The challenge facing your democracy is neither nostalgic return to an imagined golden past nor naive embrace of technological solutions that ignore human nature, but rather the recovery of the balance between freedom and equality, between individual rights and civic duties, between local engagement and national purpose that has always been democracy's greatest achievement and its most difficult task. Conclusion. The hidden contradiction I discovered in American freedom nearly 2 centuries ago remains democracy's central and defining challenge: how to preserve individual liberty within the framework of collective self-government, how to maintain meaningful equality without destroying the excellence that freedom makes possible, how to encourage the diversity that enriches democratic life while sustaining the unity that makes democratic action effective. Your democracy's enduring greatness lies not in resolving these contradictions, which would be impossible, but in living creatively and constructively within them, turning permanent tension into productive energy. Each generation of Americans must rediscover democracy's delicate balance through active participation in the voluntary associations, local institutions, and civic discussions that transform isolated individuals into a democratic people capable of self-government. The alternative is not the dramatic collapse of democratic institutions, which would provoke resistance, but their gradual transformation into instruments of soft despotism, a comfortable servitude where citizens trade freedom for security and discover too late that they have lost both, becoming dependent children of an administrative state that manages their lives with benevolent efficiency. Your responsibility as democratic citizens is to recognize that freedom is never finally won, but must be continually renewed through the daily practice of democratic life. Democracy requires not just your votes, but your voice, not just your rights, but your duties, not just your individual success, but your civic engagement and concern for the common good that makes individual flourishing possible.